Could there be a seismic shift at America's top court? A vacancy opens up as a judge announces his retirement. How will Trump's new appointee reshape American life? I'm Imran Gata, and today's newsmaker is the U.S. Supreme Court. When Justice Anthony Kennedy announced he was retiring, there was a collective groan from the left. Why? Because Kennedy was seen as the Supreme Court's swing vote. He may have been nominated by a Republican president, but on certain issues, Kennedy was anything but conservative. He upheld abortion rights by refusing to overturn Roe v. Wade and voted in favor of legalizing gay marriage. Now Donald Trump has the chance to install a new judge and shift the court further to the right. So how will the president's pick change America? Here's Christine Pirovalakis.
The highest court in the United States is about to go through a shakeup. Justice Anthony Kennedy is retiring. The Supreme Court is made up of 9 justices who serve lifetime appointments. They're nominated by the president and approved by the Senate. The justices are normally divided into liberal and conservative camps and tend to vote the way the presidents who nominated them expected. But Kennedy was an exception. Despite being appointed by a Republican president, Kennedy often sided with liberal justices on social issues. He was a reliably conservative vote on other cases, like campaign finance reform. Now Kennedy's retirement gives conservatives the chance to tip the scales of the court to work more in their favor.
He felt confident in me to make the right choice and carry on his great legacy. That's why he did it.
President Donald Trump now has the chance to appoint his second Supreme Court justice. Presidents Barack Obama and George W. Bush each made only 2 appointments over 8 years in office. From guns to gay rights, Kennedy was the swing vote on a number of landmark cases.
You only have to select a slightly more conservative nominee to get cascading results across about half a dozen areas of law.
While the U.S. Supreme Court rules on issues that affect Americans, many decisions have international consequences. Back in 2000, the court stopped the recount in the presidential election between Bush and Al Gore. That outcome put Bush in the White House, and the U.S. headed towards war in Afghanistan and Iraq. Last week, the Supreme Court upheld Trump's travel ban in a 5-4 ruling, with the decision affecting millions of people around the world.
The Supreme Court of the United States has just given a green light to Donald Trump's religious discrimination and has given him the green light to discriminate against a group of people based on their faith wherever and whenever he chooses.
People from Iran, Syria, Yemen, Libya, Somalia, North Korea, and Venezuela are banned from coming into the United States.
This is a great victory for our Constitution. We have to be tough, and we have to be safe, and we have to be secure.
With the court deeply divided along ideological lines, every vote counts. And many liberals in the U.S. are worried Kennedy's retirement puts the civil rights of immigrants, women, and gay people in danger. Trump promised during his presidential campaign to overturn Roe v. Wade, the decision legalizing abortion in the U.S. And when Kennedy's gone, all eyes will be on another judge, 85-year-old liberal Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and whether she too will retire under Trump. So what impact will Trump's appointments have, not only on the Supreme Court, but on life in America for the decades to come? Christine Pirovalakis, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Hans von Spakovsky. He was a policy board member of the American Civil Rights Union and a former member of the Federal Election Commission. From Philadelphia is Michael Johns. He's the co-founder of the Tea Party and a former speechwriter for President George W. Bush, H.W. Bush rather. And in New York is Jake Falaskini. He's the director of the Federal Courts Program at the Center for American Progress. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us on The Newsmakers. Jake, let me begin with you. Is the retirement of Anthony Kennedy that significant, or are Democrats just overreacting a little bit?
This is incredibly earth-shattering. It would be, I think, difficult to underscore just how incredibly important this actually is for our country and our Constitution and our constitutional democracy at the moment. The rights of LGBT people, of women to access safe and legal abortion, of anyone trying to access affordable health care, all of those rights and several others are under threat.
Michael Johns, incredibly earth-shattering. Tell me why you disagree.
Well, I do acknowledge it's an important appointment. I mean, obviously, whenever you have an opportunity to appoint a Supreme Court justice who likely in this case is going to be there for 3 or more decades, it's considerably important. On the other hand, you know, this is why we have elections in the United States. We had one in 2016. The issues related to the court, all of these themes, not just the issue that's receiving the most attention of Roe v. Wade and abortion, but many other themes received a lot of deliberation and debate and consideration. The American people have decided to move in a direction. And so the president is looking at an appointment that I think is going to reflect, importantly, if you're concerned about the Constitution, which I think we all are, an originalist approach, meaning that the Constitution means what it says, that it's not the role of the Supreme Court to be either putting together legislation or actually, engaged in activist approaches from the court. So I think we're likely to see whoever emerges from this, someone who's committed to the Constitution and the employment of it.
Okay, that's interesting because both of you agree that it is important, but for different reasons. And I guess you both disagree on your interpretation of what the Constitution actually means. Hans, to Jake's point about the fact that LGBT rights, abortion rights, minority rights, voting rights, these things will now be under threat based on who Trump's replacement is, and we expect that to be a conservative. Your response to that is what?
Well, my response is I think that's a gross exaggeration. I'll just give you a couple of examples. In the term that just ended of the U.S. Supreme Court, there were 19 cases that were decided 5-4. Justice Kennedy was the 5th vote in all of those cases, all 19 of them, including the travel ban case. He was also the fifth vote that just threw out, as a First Amendment violation, requirements that the state of California was putting on pro-life centers in the abortion area. So, yeah, while there may be some change if the president puts a new nominee on the court, in many cases, majority of cases, Justice Kennedy was already voting with the other conservative members of the court. And on health care, remember, he was one of the dissenters that voted in the Obamacare decision to say that the Obamacare health law was unconstitutional.
Right. Okay. So, Jake, what kind of, who's this phantom liberal judge the Democrats and liberals are pining for? Because on all these recent issues, including voting rights in Texas and Ohio recently, on the Muslim ban, which we will talk about a little bit later on, Justice Kennedy was on side with all the conservatives.
It's true that in this term, Justice Kennedy did decide more with the 4 conservatives than he did with the liberals, but that hasn't always been the case going back decades. Justice Kennedy has traditionally been the one swing vote from the conservative side who has been willing to join with liberals. He built the entire constitutional structure that's recognized the rights of LGBTQ Americans, siding with the 4 liberals. He also has been one of the few swing justices who's been willing to recognize the incredible impact that the Constitution and the laws have on minorities in America, and have been willing to recognize minority rights. So I don't think that it's an exaggeration, especially when it comes to Roe v. Wade and other areas of settled law, to suggest that this will be a threat on the current constitutional structure of American rights.
Right. Hans, when you hear Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic minority leader in the House, saying, and I quote, Kennedy's successor could radically alter the course of American justice for decades. The future of our democracy is at stake. What's your response to that?
Well, my response to that is that when liberal justices create rights that are not in our Constitution, that is a very anti-democratic process, and that's what threatens our democracy, not judges who uphold the Constitution as it's written and our Bill of Rights with the rights that it has in it.
Jake?
The Constitution has an equal protection clause, and our liberal justices and Justice Kennedy have been working to uphold that for all Americans. I think what's incredibly at threat is the idea that these constitutional protections for minorities will just be thrown away with very little recognition of how it's impacting minorities in the United States.
Right. Michael Johns, let me ask you, if you were on the other side of the fence, if you were a Democrat, what should the Democrats do? Should they maybe tactically try and block in appointments until the midterms and try and win those midterms? Is that what you think they should do if you were on their side?
What they shouldn't be doing is what they're doing now, which is essentially acknowledging and announcing their opposition to a nominee who's not even going to be announced for another week yet. So I think both from a tactical and a political standpoint, they're reflecting that they're just going to be oppositionists and resistance-oriented no matter what. So that's an error. I do think the Senate's role in advising consent is hugely important. We went through this ourselves with the Kagan nomination, and our approach was to vigorously question Justice Kagan on a number of issues that were considered critically important. And ultimately, when it came to the vote, there had to be an acknowledgement of the president's authority to make an appointment, and unless there's some completely outstanding, remarkable and egregious reason to oppose the nomination,
right,
that comes either as a matter of principle or that comes out of the hearings, you have to vote to approve that nominee, and I expect that's largely what will happen, and I think it'll be a closer, more contentious vote than it needs to be, and that's not good for the country necessarily.
Jake, are you jumping the gun by maybe saying the checks and balances have been weakened already before we even know who Trump wants to appoint?
Trump already made explicit who it is that he wants to appoint to the Supreme Court. He said that he has a list of 25 that he'll be choosing from. On the campaign trail and afterwards, he said he had explicit litmus tests for who those folks would be and what beliefs they would bring to the court. Some of those were overturning Roe v. Wade, failing to protect the rights of LGBTQ Americans, and then he criticized Justice John Roberts for his decisions on upholding the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act. No, I don't think that we're jumping the gun. If anything, I think that our senators need to be stronger in saying that they will accept no one from this list of narrow-minded elitists that have been put forward by the Trump administration after being vetted by right-wing special interest groups.
Hans, do you buy any of that?
No. The list of 25 are all people with stellar credentials, with terrific backgrounds, and that kind of insulting attack, unfortunately, is what we're going to see in the upcoming fight. Look, I don't agree with many of the views on the law that Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan have. But look, they were approved because the President Obama, had the right to choose them, and they had the professional credentials required to be on the court. Unfortunately, what we're going to see is a propaganda war that is probably going to be the vilest, nastiest attack we've ever seen on someone being nominated for the court. And the attacks have started before the person's even been named. That shows how incredibly unfair these attacks are going to be.
Jake, is that fair?
No, I mean, we've had a chance to know who these people are. Sure, they may be credentialed, but credentialed does not a constitutionalist make. I mean, we see that with many of the decisions that have been coming out recently to radically alter the law. We saw that in the Muslim ban decision, where the Chief Justice with with Kennedy and 3 other conservatives decided to essentially ignore the president's explicit statements denigrating an entire population of Americans and immigrants.
Right.
And so, no, I don't think it's at all unfair.
Okay. We're going to actually sort of drill down and focus on the travel ban or the Muslim ban. Now we're going to say goodbye to Hans von Spakovsky and bring in Jonathan Smith. He's the legal director at Muslim Advocates. They work to guarantee freedom and justice for Americans of all faiths. Jonathan, I know you're against the travel ban or the Muslim ban, but do you believe it goes so far as to build in discrimination into U.S. law?
It does. You know, President Trump ran on a platform and a campaign of anti-Muslim bigotry and discrimination. On national television, he said things like, Islam hates us. He called for a complete and total shutdown of Muslims into the United States. And so the Supreme Court's decision to affirm his Muslim ban sends the message to all Americans that bigotry and discrimination are acceptable. And that's a disgrace not just for those individuals directly impacted by the policy. It's a disgrace for all Americans who value our constitutional norms of equality and justice for all people.
Michael Johns, has the Supreme Court rubber-stamped bigotry?
Absolutely not. I mean, firstly, this is not a Muslim ban. The vast majority of Muslims are free to travel to the United States. Two of the countries included in the 7, Venezuela and North Korea, have very minimal Muslim populations.
Although those were added later on in a revision
in these respective
countries.
Michael,
we know the roots. We know the roots
Correct.
of the proposal, right? So the president himself has used those words, and that's why we use them.
Yeah, well, and I do understand that, and I think you have to separate a position that the president took after the San Bernardino attacks, I believe it was, during the campaign from the reality of what he's doing and has done in 2018, which is to take 7 countries that were identified by the previous Democratic administration as not having concrete or fundamentally sound vetting processes for individuals entering the United States. So the primary obligation of the President of the United States, which I think many liberals have forgotten, is not to opening our country to any and all foreigners who want to come here, but to the security of American citizens. And when there's good reason to believe, as there is in these 7 cases, that the individuals involved have not been sufficiently vetted and they could potentially represent a threat to the United States, that needs to be employed. Finally, I would just point out, in all 7 cases, there is a waiver process that's available. So it's not a complete suspension of all ability to enter the U.S. if there's a compelling reason to do it, for business reasons, for students who may be attending U.S. universities, for other compelling reasons. There is an opportunity to apply that. And so, finally, it's a suspension, not a termination, meaning those countries already have been removed from the list, Chad, for instance, and others could be as they improve their vetting processes.
Okay, and this is interesting. Jake, let me ask you from a legal perspective, do you buy the argument that, okay, we know the roots might have been a certain thing after San Bernardino, the president said some things, he was angry, there was a populist wave, there was an election and so forth, but it evolved and it went through legal processes as well. They even included Venezuela and North Korea, and that's what got to the debate within the Supreme Court. It's a different animal right now which has legal validity. Do you think that that checks out for you?
It doesn't. You can put lipstick on a pig, but it's still a pig. At the end of the day, the president said explicitly on the campaign trail that he was looking to ban Muslims from the United States. He had it up on his website until May after when he took office. His legal advisors have it said on the record that the president instructed them to find a legal way to enact a Muslim ban in the United States. The 2 predominantly non-Muslim countries that are now a part of the travel ban already had restrictions in place, and the restrictions that are the exceptions and the waivers that have been put in place for people traveling from the Muslim countries that are still a part of the ban have not been rigorously or uniformly enforced. So no, I don't buy that argument. This is still a Muslim ban.
Okay, so
just as Justice Sotomayor said in her dissent.
Right, and she did, yes, and she was joined by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and she said it is of no moment that Trump included minor restrictions on North Korea and Venezuela. So, Jonathan, let me get your opinion on Anthony Kennedy vacating his seat, along with what this means for something like the Muslim ban. And this is the way I'm going to do it. You have the Supreme Court, affirming this ruling, right? Passing the travel ban. Now there's a vacancy. The swing vote is gone. We know it's quite likely that President Trump is going to put in a more conservative-leaning judge of his choosing who might support further restrictions, perhaps, on this sort of issue. What does that mean for you in terms of civil rights and civil rights of Muslims in America when you see this vacancy and you know that it's going to be filled by a Trump pick?
Well, first and foremost, it's imperative that the Supreme Court be an institution that values the core values and beliefs of our democracy. And it's imperative now that we have a new vacancy on the court that the President and Congress and the Senate make sure that whoever is nominated and ultimately conforms with those basic values and beliefs. And so we, as many other civil rights organizations, will do our part to make sure that whoever is nominated actually will respect the Equal Protection Clause, will respect all the guarantees in our Constitution and our laws. And yes, to your broader question, this is a very dark day, not in this country, not just for American Muslims, but for immigrant communities, for communities of color, for all people who feel demonized and vilified and attacked. And so it's really important that we, as all Americans, come together and demand that our president and our elected officials nominate and confirm people that will protect all Americans, regardless of where they come from or what they believe.
Michael Johns, do you have sympathy with that perspective?
I'd like to, but I don't. I think it's a very vague allegation. It's a very serious allegation, and it's not rooted in any fundamental fact. If you have an issue with U.S. immigration policy, and particularly the travel ban, you need to go back to the 1952 statute, because it is the obligation of Congress, the body of the people, of elected representatives, to create immigration policy for the United States of America. It is not the role of the Supreme Court to do that, and it's undeniably true that that 1952 statute gave the President of the United States complete authority over travel rights into the U.S. His steps could have been much more restrictive than they actually were and still been entirely constitutional. And unfortunately, I think this is the place we found ourselves in with contemporary liberalism, is that they've been unable to win the elections necessary to conduct governance through proper channels. They've attempted to govern through the courts. And what President Trump correctly is doing is sending a message that that is not the role of any of our courts, and certainly not of the Supreme Court. It is the role of the Supreme Court to interpret the Constitution and the laws thereof, not to make laws.
Final response from you, Jonathan. Go ahead.
I think that that's a really disappointing response. And I think, to not acknowledge that there's been a rise of hate crimes, to not acknowledge that there's been a rise of acts of discrimination and bigotry and hatred in our country, is to put your head in the sand and not pay attention to what we see every day in this country. This isn't about the Supreme Court legislating. It's about the Supreme Court and all elected officials and all appointed officials holding up our sacred obligations in this country. And so it is really important, not just in the context of the Muslim ban, but moreover, that we make sure that we adhere to those fundamental values, that we adhere to what makes us great as a country. What makes us great is when we're inclusive, when we're inviting, when we don't turn away people because of what they look like. And unfortunately, this president is taking us down a wrong road, a dark road, and hopefully all people will come together and say enough is enough. That's simply not who we are as Americans, and that's not what our country represents.
Okay, gentlemen, I'd love to continue, but I've got to move on. I'd love to have you all back on the program in the not-too-distant future. Michael Johns, Jake Falaskini, Jonathan Smith, and earlier Hans von Spakovsky. I thank you all for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Now, just before we move on, let's go off script for a moment. So yes, U.S. Justice Anthony Kennedy is retiring, and this swing vote judge stepping down could have major ramifications for the future of the U.S. But let's pause for a second and consider something. An 81-year-old man who has paid his dues wants to take a rest. What does it say when the whole system is thrown into a specific political direction for many years to come because of who the president is? All stemming from an appointment in a court that is supposed to provide the checks on the president. Also, what does it say about the system that we can more or less accurately predict, looking ahead for decades to come, in which direction Supreme Court judges will vote, despite all their qualifications and legal experience, commitment to the profession to rule justly and objectively. These four will rule to the right, these four will rule to the left. But maybe all the noise about Kennedy is this: not on all rulings, but on many votes through the years, he was the one who bucked the trend. Republicans couldn't count on him even though they appointed him. You couldn't fully figure him out, which was a good thing. These are judges, not politicians. But with this opportunity, is Trump about to make the Supreme Court far more easy to figure out? Still to come on the Newsmakers, left-wing landslide in Mexico as the country elects a new president. Can Lopez Obrador end corruption and save the economy? And South Sudan's historic peace deal crumbles within hours. Who's to blame? And can it still be salvaged? Mexico has elected a new president. After running for office twice before, voters have now elected Andrés Manuel Lopez Obrador as Mexico's first left-wing leader in decades. The former mayor, known as AMLO, has pledged to tackle violence, wipe out corruption, and improve the country's economy. But it won't be easy. Despite being the second largest economy in Latin America, more than 40% of Mexicans live in poverty, and crime is at an all-time high. So, will the left-wing populist deliver on his promises? Haider Abbasi reports.
Polls showed there was little doubt he'd win. The only question was how big the victory was going to be for Mexico's Andrés Manuel Lopez Obrador. Turns out it was substantial. Lopez Obrador secured 53% of the vote. His nearest rival, conservative Ricardo Anaya, trailed with just 27% of votes. It's a sea change for politics in Mexico.
I will govern honestly and justly. I will not fail you. I will not disappoint you, and I will not betray my people.
Lopez Obrador is Mexico's first leftist president in decades. His win ends the dominance of the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or PRI, and the National Action Party. He's a former mayor of Mexico City and failed twice before in runs for the presidency. So how did this political outsider obliterate the opposition? Critics say Mexicans are fed up with endemic corruption, violence, and poverty. And these have all increased under the rule of the outgoing president Enrique Peña Nieto. Lopez Obrador has promised to eradicate graft, saying it's the reason why so many people are poor. But perhaps worse than the corruption in Mexico is the murder rate. This election campaign was the most violent in living memory. Since campaigning began in September, at least 130 local candidates and party workers have been murdered. And in terms of overall murders, last year was the worst in Mexico since records began in 1997, with just over 29,000 people killed. Mexico's government blamed the rising violence on the many drug cartels. But Peña Nieto has been criticized for not being able to provide basic security. It was under his watch that 43 student teachers disappeared from the city of Iguala in 2014, a tragedy that drew international attention.
It will be very difficult to break the current levels of complicity between the authorities and organised crime. It will require a strong government that also has the support of the people. The most important thing will be to pursue the politicians that have allowed this to occur.
Lopez Obrador has made some big promises. On the economy, he says there'll be no nationalisation and he'll respect private businesses. And he'll double pensions for the elderly.
There will be no need to increase taxes in real terms, nor for the country to fall into debt. There will also be no hikes in petrol. I will lower the general cost of living and the public investment to propel productive activities and to create jobs.
But analysts warn he's given few details on how he's going to fulfill such ambitious pledges. He also heavily criticized US President Donald Trump during his campaign, but Lopez Obrador says he'll pursue friendship with the United States. So despite being granted an impressively big mandate, Will Lopez Obrador actually be able to tackle the many problems facing Mexico? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Mexico City is Federico Lemont. He's a journalist with El Sol de Mexico newspaper. And also with us is Luis Gomez Romero. He's a senior lecturer in human rights, constitutional law, and legal theory at the University of Wollongong. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. Luis, let me begin with you. Mexicans have elected a new president. Is it a good choice?
It was something I was expected because Peña Nieto, the incumbent president, Enrique Peña Nieto, did things so badly that Lopez Obrador left the polls, most of the polls during the entire campaign, and he was able to channel the discontent of the Mexican people against Peña Nieto's administration. So the Mexican people were fed up with the bad government of the previous administration, and now they had a chance to punish that government through their votes.
Right.
In that sense,
right.
It was a good decision, I think.
Right. Okay. So, Federico, I think many Mexicans will agree that Peña Nieto was bad, but make the argument for why Lopez Obrador is the solution.
Because since 1994, when he runs for governor from the state of Tabasco, he changed the whole Mexican political scenario. He ran with a leftist effort during his campaign of 2006, when, as a matter of fact, he won the elections. He beat it, Mr. Felipe Calderón. He starts to talking to people, the pure, lower people from Mexico, that he can change the whole thing. Let me tell you something. In the country land, the peasants earned $1 a day in the Mexican Republic. And there are just 200 people that takes the control of all the Mexican Republic. So when Mr. Lopez Obrador took the leftist side, even though he belongs to the PRI, the actually ruling party, he convinced most of the people that things can change in a country that has been beaten by corruption. Just let me give you one example. According to the Spaniard newspaper La Vanguardia, one of the former Mexican presidents stole to the Mexicans $23 billion when he finished his tenure. So just figure out how corruption has killed the most of the Mexicans' imaginations. One single former president earned $25 billion. Can you believe in that? And second idea. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, let me bring in Luis here. So Luis,
second idea.
Okay, just very, and you can give us the second idea in a couple of moments' time. I'm gonna bring in Luis. So Luis, Peña Nieto wasn't loved towards the end. Corruption is rife, undoubtedly. We just got some statistics from Federico as well. Is the answer, Luis, leftist populism? Is the answer that Mexico needs a left-wing leader with a populist bent?
Well, what I would have liked to perhaps to find in Lopez Obrador's platform was a little more specificity about how he is planning to tackle the problem of corruption. What he basically promised during the campaign was that he was going to be honest, and that if the president is honest, then the government will be honest as well. This is based on the general principle that no one is above the law. However, just the extent and the depth of corruption in Mexico would require more sophisticated approaches to corruption. So in this sense, I think that his diagnosis is correct, and yet his proposals lack the depth or the substance that is required for such a big problem.
Okay, so is that true, Federico, that he's diagnosed it properly, but he hasn't quite given much specifics when it comes to what he's actually going to do to solve these problems?
Well, let me give you an example. According to what he says, during the beginning of this former presidential campaign, he says, with those amount of money that politicians used to take from Mexico's treasury, we can pay to some scholarships to Mexican students. Because according to him and to the World Bank, every year in Mexico, politicians stolen at least 900 billion pesos from the treasury. With that amount of money, you can solve a lot of things. Most important, fighting poverty. Because if we couldn't have had this change yesterday, we might be facing a revolution. In Mexico, with a population of close to 130 million people, at least 90 million people live under difficult problems, and 26 up to 32 million live with at least $2 a day.
Right.
So there won't be any solution in Mexico if people wouldn't turn like this.
Right. Okay. So, Luis, I want to ask you about the United States. There was an interesting piece in the Daily Beast, and I want to know whether you think the Americans incorrectly think everything is about them, or there might be some truth to this. This is called Unintended Consequences in Daily Beast. It says, Mexico's anti-Trump, Andrés Manuel Lopez Obrador, is even more populist than Donald Trump. By insulting and bullying Mexico and Mexicans, Trump antagonized Mexicans into supporting his mirror image, a tenacious ideologue and unabashed proponent of the working class. This from Jason McGahan. So, do the Americans think everything is about them, or is there some truth to that, Luis?
Oh, I think that there were very serious domestic issues at play in this election. So it is not everything about the United States. Of course, is very important. 80% of Mexico's exports go to the United States, and yet not everything is about the United States. For example, going some of the depth that I was talking about in the proposals that are needed is the reform of the justice system. One of the proposals Lopez Obrador that was criticized was the prosecutor that will persecute corruption. Lopez Obrador said that this prosecutor will depend directly from the president, from him. And this is not a warranty against corruption. There were other proposals to structure a prosecutor and attorney against corruption that should be autonomous, so that any member of the government then that would be indicted for corruption then could be investigated properly with an independent prosecutor.
Okay, very finally, Federico, if you don't mind, if you could keep your answer very, very short. Relationship with the United States. He says he wants to have a good relationship with the United States. What does that mean?
That he will strengthen with the North American Free Trade Agreement. He will support it. And that is why he has called a former Undersecretary of Relations, Marcelo Ebrard, to be in charge of the negotiations with the North American Free Trade Agreement. One. Second, Donald Trump is not an enemy of Mexico, according to what Mr. Lopez Obrador stated during his last visit on March to the USA. He, in New York, stated, I will demand the U.S. aid before the United Nations because they have been violating human rights from our migrants. And he stated as well in New York, LA, the places that he visited on March, that things will change dramatically if he became president of Mexico.
Okay, gentlemen, it's been great getting a deeper understanding of what this new presidency means for Mexico and the region. Unfortunately, I've got to move on. But Federico Lamont and Luis Gomez Romero, I thank you both for joining us here on the Newsmakers.
I'm committed to respect the whole document that I have signed and will abide by all the agreements that will follow.
That was President Salva Kiir after he signed an historic peace deal with his former vice president turned rival Riek Machar. It was supposed to help end South Sudan's almost 5-year civil war, which has claimed thousands of lives and left millions homeless. But within a matter of hours, the ceasefire was violated, with both sides accusing the other of firing first. It's not the first time a peace deal has failed. In 2015, both parties signed an agreement to end the violence, but that collapsed within a year. So how can South Sudan achieve peace? Well, let's ask our panel. Joining me now from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, we have Goy Uyul Yol. He's a member of the opposition and part of South Sudan's peace negotiation team. And in Washington, D.C. is former diplomat Luca Quol. He's a professor at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies at the U.S. National Defense University. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Let me start with you, Goy Uyul Yol. The government is not as clear as you guys are about who broke the ceasefire. Was it them or was it you?
If you could remember, Imran, many peace agreements were signed and ceasefires were signed, and they did not hold for the next 24 hours of signing them. This time, it is the government that is being blamed to have attacked us in Kajukeji, attacked us in Lair, and other areas.
What are you going to do now? Are you going to attack them back, or are you going to stay committed to the Khartoum Declaration?
No, we are committed to that peace agreement in Khartoum. You know, people have suffered a lot, and it's time now to stop the war. At this juncture, we are committed, and we have called our forces to just respond in self-defense and not to pursue any fight.
Luca Quol, what does it say that within 24 hours of a major declaration of peace between Kiir and Machar, we have fighting again?
I think people should not be surprised. I think these two leaders have consistently shown that they will not be able to work together, but also they will not be able to stop the war. And it is very clear that the whole international community, the region, the people of South Sudan, they know for sure these two leaders, there is no way they can be able to help the people of South Sudan to retain their life. So I'm not surprised, because the two parties, the government and the opposition, they don't have control over their armies. Because if you take the government of South Sudan, they don't have even the command of their forces. Leave alone you have, these are the people not paid for 7 months. And the same thing for the opposition. You have a fraction and then divided. So these are the people that don't have command of their forces. Even though they are talking about 72 hours, we are going to see even more to happen. And that's why some of us, we are saying these two leaders, they should be candid enough to accept that they have failed the country. And then they should step down and give chance to young generation to take us through until elections are held.
Yeah.
So we should not be surprised. We are going to see even more.
Oh, okay, and that's depressing to hear. So Goy, let me ask you, tens of thousands dead, all international goodwill gone. Everybody was so excited about South Sudan becoming its own independent country. 4 million people displaced, the economy collapsed. Can you tell me honestly, Goy, what are you fighting for?
It's very unfortunate. You know, we just got independent in 2011, and people of South Sudan were having a lot of hopes to have a better country that is new with a lot of resources. But unfortunately, the system in Juba dashed the hopes of the people. And the reason the opposition is there is to reform the lives of the people and to bring people back, the life back to normalcy. You know, you have in South Sudan an army that kills its own people. You have a system that is not transparent. There's a lot of corruption in the oil sector. There's no accountability. You know, you cannot run a country like that. You cannot have a country that that is being run like a private company. You know, for that reason, SPLM-IO is there to bring in reforms for the people of South Sudan in military sector, in security sector, and all the sectors that are there in.
Okay, but Goy, it's not just Luka criticizing both sides. We have Musa Faki Mohammed, the AU chief, saying we are now used to the key actors in South Sudan not respecting their commitments. The situation is intolerable. It is time to act, to accept our responsibility. So it's not just critics of the government and the opposition saying both sides. It's actually the African Union trying to sort this out, trying to stop the bloodshed, trying to stop the refugees from being displaced internally and externally. They're saying all those things that you're criticizing the government over, you guys are doing as well.
If you could just have seen the yesterday's IGAD communique, you know, they were saying that the Khartoum agreement is endorsed by IGAD, and in there you could see clauses like they should not pursue people, they should not pressure people or make them accountable. I do disagree with that. I do believe that pressure from AU and other actors is very important, you know, for all of us, for both leaders, for Salva and Dr. Riek Machar to come to the terms of a very credible peace agreement. You know, you cannot throw away all these sanctions. You know, you continue waiving them, because at the end of the day, the guilty party will be the one fighting it off.
Dr. Luka Kwol, are you convinced by any of that?
Look, let me say the following. The parties who have signed this Khartoum agreement, although I agree the only good aspect of it is the ceasefire, the permanent ceasefire, which is very unique that you jump to the permanent ceasefire, but while you've been violating. What they have done, two things. First, they have accepted that they have failed to provide security to the citizens of South Sudan. And they have failed to manage the economy. And the bad thing is for them to relinquish the very function of any sovereign state to another country, to Sudan. And for me, it is a clear case that the leaders, the elites in the South Sudan, they have failed to govern. And that's why some of us, we believe it is very important at this point of time that the security sector itself should be managed by a third party, especially the African Union, I mean the Regional Protection Force and United Nations mission in South Sudan, while you reform the security sector. And I think it's very important. They have accepted already in the security arrangement.
Okay.
The second one is the economy itself. The economy itself.
Right. Finish your point.
Yeah, the economy itself. There's no way you can hand over the oil sector to Sudan, a corrupt country. And this is a sector, it would have been better. You put this, the revenue from the oil, to a escrow account to be managed by the World Bank so that you can meet the humanitarian needs, which is about 1.7 billion, rather than handing the whole management of the oil sector to Sudan.
Okay, so two interesting points. Goy, let's look at security first. Would you accept the AU and the UN, maybe a hybrid force, maybe something beefed up, taking control of the security situation? Because it's clear on both sides, from the government and from your side, the opposition, you guys can't sort out security. Even if you have good intentions, we have too many reports of rapes, we have too many reports of killings. Enough is enough. UN troops, UN and AU troops on the ground, do you accept that?
You know, if you look at the ceasefire agreement, you know, we signed that as a good faith to start forward to implement other issues. Khartoum being in the picture is not really the case here, because Khartoum is part of IGAD, and IGAD is endorsing this agreement, and I would not go to that side. But I would clearly agree with you that we need a higher mechanism. You know, we need somebody like AU to monitor the ceasefire and to implement the security arrangements. You know, that one would be more credible enough, because we have seen the IGAD, we have seen the CITESAM. Up to this point, they're not able to do that.
Right. And Goy, the criticism is that you have Sudan, the country that resisted you breaking away and becoming independent, taking control of your oil revenues and taking control of your economy. What does that say about your country just these few years after independence?
You know, as far as I know, you know, we have just signed a ceasefire declaration, and we are in the process of negotiating security arrangements and governance arrangements. We have not reached that point yet. It will be very sad if our resources are handed over to Khartoum. That did not happen. And, we have issues with Khartoum in the past. And I believe that historical issues should not have bearing on the current peace. The people of South Sudan at this point, at this juncture, needs peace. They have been suffering. And it should not be taken as a toy or a plaything with a few benefiting elite. Let's go to DC and Luca Cole. Map a way forward for me. Give me the best case scenario that can lead to, I guess, a permanent ceasefire, and beyond that, perhaps elections, and beyond that, stability in South Sudan. Map it forward for me. What needs to happen?
I think what needs to be happening is that for the African Union, and it is good what Musa, the chairman of the African Union, said, these two leaders, they should be asked to really step down and give way voluntarily with a clear packages for them if they exit in decency, and then to allow the new generation to come in. Like what is happening in Ethiopia, you have a new leader with the prime minister deciding to step down to give the young generation a hope for the nation. Ethiopia now is changing because of that one. So African Union should really convince the two leaders to step down and allow a new generation to come. Second, I think we should accept, and the African Union should accept the fact that the security sector is so important. These parties, they don't have control of their forces. And it is very important. You need more than 2 years in order to build a national army or even a national police. Meanwhile, African Union and the international community, especially the regional protection forces, to really come in and in order to help the country in maintaining the security. It happened in many countries. Liberia is a good example. The third is about the economy. The economy itself, it is very important. The reports by the Global Witness showed clearly how the elites are abusing this oil. While people are dying, half of the population of South Sudan are food insecure or facing famine. It is a high time for the international community to put the revenues of the oil into escrow account, but to be managed by a third party like the World Bank, and the focus actually to address the humanitarian needs, and then to go for the real restoring the livelihoods of the people. Right. Chances are there. I think these are options that can easily be done by the African Union, and the African Union should take the lead, and then the international community will come in. If you come back and you say you are going to have the same status quo of Salva Kiir and Riek Machar coming back, I am doubting whether the international community will be willing to support any government under the leadership of these two gentlemen. Okay, fresh blood as a start, perhaps. But we do know the humanitarian situation is terrible right now for the people of South Sudan, and we hope that comes to an end very, very soon. Goy Joyul Yol and Luca Kwol, for the moment, let me thank you for joining us here on The Newsmakers. That's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, will the Syrian revolution be buried where it was born as regime troops advance in Daraa province? Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.